to a good point, we'll go ahead and handle all of those questions that you might have at that particular time. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. So purchasing and expenses is the ability of being able to track your expenses to your projects, and that can happen in a couple of different ways. One would be adding in a purchase order. You're going to order something from a vendor. You want the expense to reflect on the project right away, even though you don't have the bill from the vendor just yet. So some clients start with purchase orders, and then eventually when they get the bill, you can link up a purchase order with a vendor invoice. So once they've actually invoiced you for that item that you have purchased, you would then link up the order to the vendor invoice. It would essentially close that order and replace the order as the expense on the project. There's also things called miscellaneous costs, which are items that maybe you purchased in bulk a while back, and now you've used one of those items for the project. You need to charge it to the project, but you're not going to have a vendor invoice for that particular item. So that for us would be considered to be a miscellaneous cost. And then you also have the ability of doing credit card charges. So if you're charging some of the expenses through your credit card, that would be part of expenses. And then the last one would be expense reports. So your individual employees going out paying for something with their own money, and then we need to go ahead and add in that that expense report into the system. So that's the summary of what we'll go over today. Every one of those requires items to be in the system, and items are basically what was the expense that you had. So I'm going to start in system setup, which is you have menu, admin, and system setup. That brings you here. If you do not have access to this, then your admins are probably the ones that are setting up the different items that we have in the system. So the first place that we would go to, or really the only place that we would go, would be purchasing. There's two different sections in here. It's going to be expense report items and purchase items. So if I'm filling out an expense report, so if I paid for something with my own money, I want to be reimbursed for it, these would be the items that I can use whenever I'm filling out that expense report. So you would need to put in all the categories for the items that an employee would submit an expense report for. You can have something more generic, or you can go more detailed. So car rental, airfare, if they've done mileage, a hotel or motel, public transportation. If you want to just do miscellaneous, you can go ahead and do miscellaneous as well. So these would be the only items that when I fill out an expense report, this is all I can choose from. I cannot see the purchase items list. So really important to say that you would want to make sure that you have all the items that an employee would typically purchase and then get reimbursed for. So insert row to add a new one, and you would have a couple of options. Some of you might see it collapsed. Some of you might see it condensed. It's all based off of this arrow option. So if they're pointing inward, you're seeing every detail possible. If they're pointing outward, there might be a few fields that are hiding. So, and you'll notice that for all of our screens that are similar to this, if you know that there's some sort of other field in there, but you can't find it, just use that arrow. Item ID is kind of the shortened version of the actual name. Item name is what people will see whenever they're picking from the list. So they don't see hotel, they see motel. They don't see just mileage, they see mileage expense. So just make sure that your item name is something that they would recognize whenever they're picking from the list. And then this could be the same thing, like supplies is supplies, doesn't really matter. Otherwise, you can shorten it if you need to. So item name, item ID. Active means it is an item that they can currently choose from. If there's something that we no longer reimburse for or have our employees pay for out of their own pocket, then you can uncheck the active box because you might not be able to delete that particular item if it has previously been used on an expense report. So best thing you can do is uncheck the active box, which is basically this one, and then it will stay in the system, but no one would be able to see it when they're filling out the expense report. You could put in a standard description if you need to. This would also carry into the expense report if you would like. And then you have a couple of fields in here. Unit cost would be the individual cost. So like a lot of a lot of companies reimburse at a specific unit rate for expenses or mileage. So you can put in that cost, and then what will happen is whenever someone fills out an expense report, they won't have to fill in unit cost. They would just have to do the quantity, and then it'll go ahead and times that by that unit cost. And then unit rate is typically, if you're billing it out to the client, what rate are you billing it out at? So I might be unit cost of 0.575, but maybe we mark it up and it ends up being 0.75 that we bill out to the client. So that's the difference between unit cost and unit rate. So typically you would put in your markup, maybe we do like 10% or 15%. And then you'll notice that field would come in. So again, once you fill this out, it'll go ahead and determine what that unit rate is. If you are having this particular item, there is going to be an expense account linked to it. So this would pull up your typical expense accounts. And then if you were to bill it out to a client, what sales account would this be linked to? Billing items are a way to group things together. So if we are billing a client for several expense reports, do we want to just group all of those under something called reimbursed out-of-pocket costs and it totals all of them up? Or do we want to list out, okay, there was car rental and that cost us $300. There was food and beverage and that cost us $200. And there was mileage. Usually you don't want to fill up the invoice with all kinds of different lines. We usually go summary. So that's what a billing item does, is if I have all of these listed as reimbursed out of pocket expense is the name of my, or pocket costs, which is the name of my billing item, then when I bill all of those, it'll just put one line and then total all of it up. So that's what a billing item is. The next fields would be a department. So if you're using departments, then you can go ahead and track your expense all the way down to that particular department. If you're required to charge tax on any items or for certain clients, then you want to go ahead and check the box for tax supplies. And then what will happen is if the client in their record has tax supplies listed, and then we bill them for individual items, then tax is going to come into that invoice automatically. I'm not going to have to tell the system to do it because it'll know, okay, well, if this client is charged tax and this item is a taxable item, then go ahead and tax that particular client based off of the tax rates. So either tax 1 or not very often, but sometimes tax 2 would apply. You would go ahead and check the box for that as well. So that's your expense report items. There is a couple of options in here. So if you also wanted to see the expense account and the sale account on this grid, you can do that under settings. You have this edit columns option. It'll show you every available field that you can pull into the grid. And then, so if I wanted sales account and expense account, you check the box for those. And then if you scroll up, you'll also be able to put in what order you want the grid to be in. So if you click over to display field, you can go ahead and click and drag where those items should be. So if I want sales and expense account to be a little bit closer, maybe I want the rate to be down here, taxable down here, maybe I want active to be a little closer. Once I click done and save, when I go ahead and refresh the screen, it'll go ahead and refresh my grid. So if I just either refresh, clicking into my browser, then you would see sales and expense account in here now as well. And again, that's going to work for pretty much all of your fields that you would have that are in a grid style. If you have settings, you typically will have some sort of option to go in and edit the columns. So that was the first section only for expense report items. So again, when we're filling out expense reports, those are the items that someone can choose from. Next one is the actual purchase items. So these would be the items that I can choose whenever I'm creating a miscellaneous costs, a purchase order, a vendor invoice, or a credit card charge. It's only going to pull from this list the purchase items. So you would typically want to go in and put the different items that maybe you would ever have as an expense, either for a project or even outside of a project. You could also put things like rent or your phone bill or whatever it might be. So you would put in the items in here, and same theory as what we saw before. So you add in an item ID. No one really sees this when they're picking from the list. This is truly what they see. You can link it to a department, link that it's taxable, put a sales and expense account, unit cost, unit description. So there's really no difference in here. It's just this is specifically for the expenses that would go on a project, like if you're printing or if you're buying shipping or something similar to that. A lot of clients do iStock photos, so that would be in this list as well. And again, if there is like a set unit cost, you can go ahead and link that up. You can also put in a standard markup for that particular item so that the system would know, okay, if I put in this particular item, we always do a 10% markup. And you could do that markup even if you don't have a specific unit rate in here. So if, again, I know that we always charge 15% markup on the color fiery, then you can put in that standard markup. And then when we go in and add this expense to a project, it'll know that it's going to be a 15% markup. So that's going to be the purchase item list. Again, you're doing the same thing that you did in the expense report items as well. So now we'll go through the process of actually filling out or creating purchase orders, vendor invoices, miscellaneous costs. So again, some people are doing purchase orders for a couple of reasons. One would be to actually send it to the vendor so that they know what we are going to be purchasing from them. Others don't send it to the vendor. They might just add in a purchase order as a placeholder to say, hey, we're expecting this $1,000 expense. We don't have the bill from the vendor, but if you put in the purchase order and link it to that project, it'll actually show against the budget and say, okay, well, here's $1,000 expense. So $1,000 away from our budgeted amount. So to start anything, I always recommend just clicking on the plus button next to your name. It's the fastest way to do it, but there are several places to add in a purchase order. So if you're doing it a different way, that's completely fine. There's not really a downfall to doing it from one place or another. It's just it's fastest if I'm not in the project to do it from here. So plus button, scroll down to purchasing, you would see purchase order. Now, if your company doesn't do purchase orders, you can skip this step altogether and just jump to a vendor invoice. But again, there are several reasons why you might do a purchase order. So we'll go ahead and go through that. So first things first is who's the vendor that we have. If I just click on the drop down, it'll show me the different vendors that we have in the system, right? So I'll just pick something in here. Next, I have GL companies turned on. You probably won't see this field unless it's turned on for you. The next one would be purchase order type. You can add in different types into the system. Otherwise, you could leave this blank. It is not a required field. Next one is if you want to put in some sort of description of what this could be, you can put in the description here. Sorry, I can't talk and type at the same time, but it could be a long-winded description if you need to, because this field will expand as you need it to. So you'll notice it'll just keep going for however long you need it. Next field would be what project does this go to? If I click on the drop down, it'll bring up all of my active projects or my projects that allow for expenses to be tied to it. So if I just choose one of my projects, I can also link it all the way down to a task level. Most people don't do this because the expenses for the project as a whole, not necessarily to one task, but some of our clients are able to tie it all the way down to the task level. So then this would pull up the list of tasks that can accept expenses. Next one is I have currencies turned on. So what currency are we using? The next field would be what are we actually doing the purchase order for? So typically you're coming down to item ID, we would click on the drop down and choose whatever that item actually is. Since I chose FedEx as my vendor, it would probably be something like shipping. If you want to narrow down your list, you can just start typing in and it'll narrow down the list so that you're not having to scroll through maybe a decent amount of items that you might have in the system. So there we go, we have shipping. It brought in the item name for me. Next field would be the standard description. So if you wanted to write a little bit about what this is, so maybe we're shipping 100 items out to, wherever, whatever, you can put in that description there. Now I can just summary and say, okay, it was one item and the total bill that we're probably going to get from FedEx is going to be, 1,400. You can do that. Otherwise, if you say, well, it was 100 of them and it was going to be, at like $14 or $140, whatever it would be, you can go ahead and put in the quantity and then what the actual unit cost is. What's the markup? So again, if I had put a markup on shipping, that would have come through automatically. If I don't do a markup, then obviously this is just a pass-through expense. But if I am marking this up, what is your percentage that you want to mark it up? I'll do 15%. It'll do the unit rate for me. So then the gross is going to be that 16,000. Is this billable to the client? If it's not billable, then obviously you're going to uncheck billable. You'll notice that my markup would go away. The gross goes away just because, again, we listed that it's not billable. So it's going to go ahead and remove the gross or put the gross at 0. This add more orders, clients get a little confused on what this would do. If I check this box, then what it's going to do is as soon as I save, it's going to go ahead and add that order, but then it's going to blank out the screen so that I can add in the next order that maybe we are expecting for that particular project as well. So it's just kind of a fast way to go in and add in multiple orders rather than going to the next screen and then filling out more detail and then having to close out and do the plus button again. It's just a little bit faster if you're doing multiple orders at the same time. If you only have the one, then don't check that box and then it'll just bring you into the actual purchase order. So we'll go ahead and save because that's all of the detail that I need to add. If I am asking for multiple items from this order, you can continue to just insert row and then fill out the line. One thing that you'll notice is I got a little yellow warning. It's not preventing me from doing anything. That's why it's in yellow. It's just saying you did not budget for this particular item. Not really anything that I need to do. It's just something to be aware of that this wasn't budgeted for. So are we going to end up going over on our expenses? So you can just kind of acknowledge it by clicking on the X, and that'll again just acknowledge it. That didn't prevent me from doing anything though. So if I need to add in more detail, then you can go ahead and click on the insert row and then again, just fill out the detail. So if you're ordering multiple things from that vendor, then just insert row to have those multiple lines. So if all is good on here, great. If I had messed up on anything, none of the fields are locked down, so you can go in and edit any part of that order. Under the details is also some of the information that we did. So if I needed to shorten this description or change it in any particular way, you can go ahead and edit anything in here. Maybe I need to add in some sort of address, city, state, zip. If you have some special instructions, you can put a deliver to. There's also the ability of copying from client or contact record. I don't know if I have any details in there. I do. So if I do that, then it'll go ahead and actually bring in the details from the client record or the contact record. You also have some instructions that you can add in. So again, if you needed delivery or special instructions, those are 2 fields that you can utilize as well. Otherwise, if all is well in there, then you can go ahead and click save and then close out. If this is all set, then orders do have to go through an approval process, just like most other items in the system. So I am an approver, so I have an approve button. If I do not have the ability to approve orders or orders up to this particular amount, then this would be a submit button and it would go to whoever is able to approve that particular amount. Okay, so I can go ahead and approve this particular order. And then if I was to look on this 003 job, then I would see this order affecting that particular project. It'll go against the budget that we have in there. So if I go to 003, there is my active project in there. So we'll click onto it. And it'll show in a couple of different places. It'll show in the budget, or it'll show in transactions. So it kind of depends on what you would prefer to see. So if I come into transactions, if I have that option, I'll go to all, and you'll notice that there is my order there. I have a couple of other items in here, but you can kind of collapse those down, and there is the order. So again, it is showing up as a transaction on the project. If I close out, I mentioned it also being on the budget. So if I click into budget, then you can go in and actually see, either you're looking at it by item. So you can see there's my shipping item, there's my gross. We never budgeted for it. So definitely important, to note that. And you might have different fields up here depending on what your company is set for, but you do have the option of editing the grid so that there's maybe different columns that you would see. But again, orders do affect your budget. It's a nice way to have it hit the project right away so that we know approximately how we're doing on the budget of the project. Now, there were a couple of questions. The first one was, can you show us how to set up the approvers? The approvers are in the employee records. So it's actually based off of individual employees. It's the one thing that's not really security group based. It's all individual. So if you have access, you have menu admin, and you're going to go into your employee section. And if I go into an employee that should be able to actually approve orders up to a certain amount, then you click into that particular person's record, and it's actually going to be under the accounting tab. So if I click into here and I scroll down, you would see purchase order, limit, insertion order, and broadcast order. Since we're only talking purchase order, you would come in and indicate how much Jerry can actually go in and approve. So if he can approve up to 1,500, you would put 1,500. If he fills out an order and it's for 1,500 or below, he'll have an approve button. If it's for 1,600, he would not be able to approve, and it would go to whoever does have 1,600 or higher. The kind of recommended way is to have at least one person go in and actually have the highest limit of any order that you would ever have. So maybe $700,000 is the most that you guys would ever order from a vendor. Then go ahead and put one person with 700,000 in there so that there is the ability of them going in and approving it. If it's not approved, it's not really hitting the budget. You also cannot link a vendor invoice to it because it was not listed as approved. Okay, so each person can have a different amount. If you have multiple people with one amount and someone submits it over, it will go to everyone, but it only requires one person to go in and actually approve. So let's say 5 people were sent the email saying there's an order to approve. One person finally goes in and actually approves it. Well, then it'll kind of disappear from everyone else's items to approve because it's already approved at that point. Okay. So that's how the tiered option will work. If you have multiple people with a limit and there's an order within that limit, they'll all get it and one person goes in and approves. Next one is if you are preparing to bill, will an open PO show up in the billing page? It depends on what your options are within that billing page. If you are looking for orders, then yes, it can show up. If you don't have your billing page set to bill orders, then they might not show up. But typically, you would be able to go in and look to see if that's available or not. So yeah, you could, it might show up in there as something for you to bill. Next one is, can you have a purchase order for a vendor and a client specific and then apply several invoices that go against the order? Yes. So that's a great question. If I am going to get billed in increments from the vendor, that order will stay open up until the amount of the order has been met. So let's say it's $10,000 total, but they're going to bill us in increments of $2,000. You fill out the first one for $2,000 and you link it to that order. 8,000 is going to show open. You fill out the next one, 6,000 would be open. So yes, that order will stay open up until the total amount of the order has been met. Now, if they go under and they're not going to send you any more bills, then you can go in and manually close it. There's a close option on an order. So if I go into the purchasing today page, it'll show me all of my open orders, typically up here. So I have a bunch of open orders, 23 of them. If we've received any particular amount in there, and they're no longer going to send us anymore, then you can go in and actually close it. This would close the order. It would no longer show as open. But yes, that was a great question. You can kind of do incremental options for the vendor invoices against a purchase order. Another question was, when the vendor invoice is received for that purchase order, how's the invoice entered in by the accountant? Yeah, so we'll go over adding in the vendor invoices as well. So that's going to be next. So now that we have the order in the system, eventually the client does bill you for that. So again, I always just do the plus button next to my name. You would scroll down to purchasing, and then again, it's right under the purchase order option. You would choose vendor invoice. So who is the vendor? I think I did FedEx. So I'll choose the same vendor as before. That little quick blue screen that happened, that's basically just validating, are there orders in the system that this could be linked to? So if I click on the drop down for order number, and we had created that order in the system for this particular expense, then you can go ahead and link it up. There's my $1,400 order. So I would go ahead and click on that. You'll notice a bunch of fields went away because it's assuming it knows the project and task, if you linked up task and items that we maybe used on there. So what's the invoice number? So you would typically look on the form, of course, and put in what their order or their invoice number is. Did you get it today? Great. Are you posting it today? Great. If not, then you're always choosing the option. And when does FedEx want us to pay this by? So, maybe we get next week to pay it, or of course it'll default to today. Is there sales tax that should be on that invoice? If so, you're clicking on the drop down, it'll show you your different sales tax rates, and then you would choose that one. If you have offices turned on, then you would also see an office field that you can specify this expense be linked to. You also have a description field and a department field. So if you wanted to put a description in here on this vendor invoice, you can. Most of the time they're pretty self-explanatory, so you could leave that blank. And then again, you also have that department field. If this was not a invoice that was going to a project, if it's more overhead, you can just click on the overhead and the system would know that it would not be linked up to a project. The last field is add more orders. So similar to how we saw the option to add more orders in the system, you also have add more vendor invoices. So again, what would happen is if I check this box and hit save, it'll go ahead and add in this vendor invoice, but then it'll blank out the screen so that I can go in and add in the next vendor invoice that I have. So I'm going to leave that unchecked because we'll assume that we're just doing the one, but we'll go ahead and save. And that'll actually pull up the order details to say, well, what did they bill you for? So typically there might be multiple lines if we had added in multiples on that order. Otherwise, it's just showing the one. So if this is what they're billing us for, great. If you need to change the detail, because we don't always get billed the amount that we put on the order, could be more or less, all of these fields are editable. Okay, so if you need to go in and edit how much we're going to bill, the unit rate, the markup, the open net, all of it, you can go in and edit. So if they came under, or again, if they're going to bill you half now and then half later, you can go in and actually edit the amount that you're going to do. Let's say it's going to be 1,200 instead because they made a mistake, then 200 would show open. But if we're not going to receive another vendor invoice for that particular order, then you can go ahead and close it. This close option, if I check the box and hit save, then it'll go ahead and close the order to say, okay, we are not expecting anything else. So you can go ahead and save. That'll actually bring that line into the actual vendor invoice. So it's pulling the detail from that order and pulling it into the invoice. So that vendor invoice. If you need to edit from here, because maybe you forgot to change the total amount, all of this is something that, again, you can edit. So it's not It's not locked down yet up until the vendor invoice is actually approved. Super important is even if you're changing the details here. So if I said, oh, we end up doing 15 instead of just 10, anything that you change in here is not going back and editing the purchase order. These are technically two different items. Yes, they're linked together, but if I change one, it's not changing the other. So if I change detail in the vendor invoice, that has no effect on the purchase order. If I go to the purchase order and change the detail, which typically you can't since it would be locked down since it's attached to this, it would not go in and actually change the vendor invoice. Okay, so they're linked, but not fully where it would update any information. Okay. So if you have all of the details filled out correctly, if there's nothing else that you need to do, again, I'm listed as an approver, so I have the option to approve. Otherwise, if it's someone else's project or we have just one person approving all of our vendor invoices, this would be a submit button and it would go to whoever is listed as the approver. Couple of items in here. If you click on the pencil, that's where you can go in and edit the invoice number, the posting, the date for the invoice, what the terms is. So a lot of that information that we saw on that very first page, that's going to be here as well. So again, if I needed to edit it, I have that option to do so. You can technically change the approver. So if I said it's actually going to be someone else and it wasn't defaulting to the right person, if you click on the blue name, it'll bring up your list of employees and then you can go in and actually choose who that would be. If I choose anyone else but myself, then it would be a submit button. Okay. So we'll go ahead and approve that. And again, what would happen on the project is it'll link that to the order. And then if it was up to the total amount of the order, it would close that order and replace the order as the expense on the project. So again, if I jump to that 002 project, when I look at transactions, I would see it as a vendor invoice rather than an order. So you'd see voucher instead of order. Okay, so again, replacing that expense. Same thing with the budget. There's really, I don't think it looks any different on here. My total is different because I did that 1200 instead. So you'll see the different fields in there, but it will go ahead and reflect in your budget as well. So again, vendor invoice replaced the order. All right, I'm going to look at the questions again. What if the invoice comes through a credit card? Will you be able to match up the purchase order with the coming charge? You cannot link credit card charges to a purchase order, but you can link it up to a vendor invoice. Because even if they're physically not sending you something, you do have a bill to pay, which you just happen to be paying through credit card. So you would want to go ahead and either just enter it as a credit card charge and not a purchase order, because there's no option to link up a purchase order with a credit card charge, or you are doing credit card charge or purchase order to vendor invoice and then linking the credit card charge to the vendor invoice. And then the last, I think I got that question. If the purchase order has been billed and the vendor invoice comes in less, will the difference show on the job? Yes, because again, that vendor invoice is going to replace the order. So it's an actual at that point, whereas the purchase order is more of like a placeholder. Okay, so that is purchase orders to vendor invoices. If you're not doing purchase orders, then it's pretty similar to what you saw. We'll just close out plus button, scroll down. You would do vendor invoice. You would type in or choose your vendor. So let's say it's going to be, I don't know, this one, right? You would skip the order field because you don't have an order to go along with it. So you would just basically put in the vendor invoice and then all of the detail. You would now have to choose a project and task and item because the order had all of that detail before. But again, if we did not do an order for that particular expense, we're skipping that field. So then we do have to choose the project if applicable. It might not go to a project because it might be overhead. So you'll notice when I choose overhead, project, item, and task, or project and task would go away. right? So project went away, task went away, because if it's overhead, it doesn't link to a project. But if I'm also doing a vendor invoice, again, we did not do an order with it in advance, then you can just fill out the field. So projects, task if needed, what's the item that we got billed for? So we'll just do something generic, supplies, fill out, let's just say we had 100 of them. Looks like I have a decent markup in here, so we'll go ahead and just change that. And then there would be my net and my gross. Again, if I uncheck billable, my gross clears out. Go ahead and save. It skips that purchase order field, so it brings us directly into the actual vendor invoice instead of going to that interim screen where we chose the order line. So again, not a whole lot different if you're not doing a purchase order in advance, if you're just filling out or adding in the vendor invoice without an order link to it. That's what it would look like. And again, if you need multiple lines, then you can go ahead and fill out or edit the rest of those lines and add them in. Okay. Same approval process. Okay, so now we're going to talk through the miscellaneous costs, right? So I'm going to go to my project. That's probably the best place to add it in. Otherwise, I actually think you can do the plus button here and do miscellaneous costs as well. But I like to add it in from, oh no, you can't do it from there. So you do have to do it through the project. So go into your project. You have miscellaneous cost as the option. And again, this was maybe I bought something in bulk, or we did something specifically for the client. Maybe we used our own paper or did our printing or our FedEx account or something similar to that. Then you can do the miscellaneous cost. So this is when you don't get a vendor invoice, but you need to charge something to the project. This is the way to do it. So click into miscellaneous cost, add a miscellaneous cost. What's the date? And again, you can link it up to a task if necessary. And then what is the item that we have, right? So I'm going to do some sort of photocopies, right? So maybe we did a bunch of photocopies. You can put in a description or more of a description in here. So if I wanted to add more detail, you can do that right here. My department came in because I have it linked up to that particular item. But again, anytime we're looking at this item list, this is just for pulling from those purchase items that we talked about at the beginning of the call. So how many did we do? Maybe we did 1,000 and they cost us 35 cents a page. So there's my total cost. If I'm marking it up, you can do that markup. So maybe we mark up 20%. So my cost per item would be 42 cents, or how I'm going to bill it out to them. And so the client would get a bill for $420, or that's what this would be worth. You also have a comment section. So some people don't add the detail here. They'll actually just put the comments here. You have that option in there. And then again, once we click out, there's no approval process for a miscellaneous cost. So it's just added in. If we look at the budget, we would see this miscellaneous costs on that against the budget. You can add in multiples. Of course, you're just continuing to insert the row to get in those additional expenses that you need to put to this project. So again, not a whole lot to miscellaneous costs. They're nice and easy, but it would then show that, hey, there was $350 that would go against the budget, and we would bill the client $420. For any item, so the question was, will the miscellaneous cost be billed if the project is set to fixed fee? Typically, no, unless you have it set to expenses are not included. So billing options here. If I toggle this over to fixed fee and I say, okay, well, there's my fixed fee amount in my approved estimate, but we're not including expenses. So anything, any expenses that we incur on the project would be billed in addition to that fixed fee amount. So if this box is not checked, it will not bill that miscellaneous cost. If this box is checked, then it is going to go ahead and prompt you to bill any expenses that are on the project. So all depends on what your billing method is set to. Okay, so that was miscellaneous costs. And then the last item would be the credit card charges. Okay, so you have to have your credit cards set up in the system first. So typically you have a GL account that's actually listed as a credit card. So I'll show you what I mean. So menu, admin, and system setup, because again, this is back end setup. You have GL settings here and GL accounts. Okay, so it's going to be in your chart of accounts or GL accounts, whatever you want to call it. But if you need to have a credit card in here, or if you have credit cards in the system, they would need to be listed here. So I have two that are added into the system. I just call it credit card, but typically you would put like B of A or whatever it actually is. And the account type would actually be credit card. So I know some would choose it as like a liability or something similar to that, but it's actually a credit card. So we have an account type of credit card. When we do that, what happens is it'll say, okay, well, who's your vendor? Who are you paying for that credit card? So who's the holder of your credit card? If it's Amex, then obviously we have the vendor in the system called Amex. We would link it up to that. If it was Bank of America or Chase or Capital One, whoever it is, you're putting in that vendor record and then you're indicating who the vendor is, who has the option of going in and actually adding charges for this particular card. You would put card users, and then that would then allow you to actually add credit card charges into the system. So you have to have them set up as a GL account. They have to be listed as a credit card, and then we'd be able to start hitting or putting charges against those particular cards. So again, I always just do the plus button to add in the credit card charge. You can do plus button, scroll down, you're still in purchasing, okay, because that is a purchasing function. You would have credit card charge as an option. So you would click into credit card charge. You would have the two options if you are a card user on both. Okay, so maybe I am just one person and I enter in all the charges for everyone, then I need to be listed as a card user. Otherwise, if each individual person is going to be entering in their own charges, again, they need to be listed as a card user when we were in those GL accounts. So since I'm a card user, I have access to both. I see both of those options. So which card am I applying this charge to? And then who actually made that purchase? And you can either free type this field. So where did you purchase it from? Right, I might put Starbucks or Target or I don't know, FedEx, whatever you want. You can go ahead and start typing in that field if you would like. So if I do Starbucks, you can go ahead and just put Starbucks in there, and then charge reference is typically what the reference of that charge is. So kind of like a specific ID for that charge, you can go ahead and put that in, or you can put that it was, you know, lunch for people. I don't know. When did we incur that charge, or when did it happen? I have to do GL company. You guys could probably skip that. If it applies to a project, you're doing project and or task. If it doesn't apply to a project and it's just for overhead, then you would have to choose the item. This is why it's helpful to have a other supplies or miscellaneous costs as an item, because Starbucks, obviously, we're not going to list every single item. We just want to do some sort of miscellaneous or general bucket to throw some of those charges under. So I would choose something a little bit generic. What's my net? I don't know, $41.75. What expense account should it hit? Do I want to put in a description? So this is maybe where I would put additional detail of what this would be. Sometimes you'll see a show more. That means that there's additional fields tucked into here. So if I show more, it'll say, do you have a receipt? Do you want to put in tax? Should we link it to an office? So a couple of other fields came in along with department. If you don't need those, then you can leave it at showing less. And then it'll just show the typical fields that you might need. So you would go ahead and save, and then that would now be a charge in the system, and it would hit the project if you actually applied the project. You'll notice that it basically blanked out the screen, but it'll show you, hey, you did add that in. So it's not that it didn't get added, but it's just that a lot of people will fill out or add in charges, multiple charges at the same time. So it just quickly blanks it out so that you're on to the next charge and it remembers what you did last, right? So If it was the Bank of America card or Amex that I chose last, it's going to remember that preference because it's assuming you're just doing all the charges for one particular card. So it blanks it out, but it did add it. If I want to jump into that actual credit card charge, you can just click on it and it'll bring you into the charge detail. This will look very similar to a vendor invoice, right? There's not a whole lot of difference, but one huge difference between vendor invoices and a credit card charge is it actually gets approved the moment that you go in and add it. So you'll notice it's approved and posted. I did not have to go in and actually click approve, and I didn't have to post it by myself. It just did it for me because I am listed as an approver. So it's assuming if I entered it in and I am an approver, I probably put it in the correct way. But you do have the option of unposting and unapproving if you need to, because maybe I entered in something wrong. You can go in and unpost, unapprove if needed. And then what happens is all of your credit card charges would then show under a listing screen, just like everything else. So you would do your magnifying glass. You can go to views, scroll down to the purchasing section. I missed it, which is right here. And if I ever needed to see all of my credit card charges, you can do credit card charges and do all and search for them. Same thing with your invoices and orders. If I ever wanted to refer back to the vendor invoice, it's not in my recents. You can go in. Typically, you might do just all invoices, or you could do all by project, all by vendor, depending on what screens or listing screens you guys have. It might be a little bit different. But if I go in and maybe just search for what was today, then it would show me the two different vendor invoices that I had for today. Or same thing with orders. If I go in and just look for everything and I do the purchase order date was today through tomorrow, then it'll show me that order that I entered in for today. Same thing with credit card charges, all credit card charges, easiest to kind of narrow down by the date that you added it in. So there's that one charge that we added in, and you can always click into them to open up those particular items. All right, so a couple of questions. If we use Plaid, we pull the Amex to Workamajig. Would this process ever be used? Typically, no. If you are having the charges either imported in through Plaid, which will do it for you, or if some clients decide to import them themselves, so you're exporting from your online banking and importing, the reason that someone would do that is maybe Plaid doesn't have that company set up, so you can't do the automatic pull. The next best bet is to import your charges, so export from your online banking and then import into the system. But if you are using Plaid, then what you're doing is you're coming into the purchasing screen, right? So you'd be menu purchasing today. There's going to show the different cards, right? So if you have them set up, it'll say, hey, here's all the charges that we have for the Bank of America. Here's all the charges that we have for the Amex card. If you click in, then it'll show you, hey, here's everything that you have. So I had at one point linked up my credit card with Workamajig, so you would see some of the charges that I would have. So what you would basically be doing is looking at the charge, and then you're basically coding it. So it'll say, hey, here's this Costco charge. Let's say it's this one since it's a decent amount. But you would check on the box, and then you can go through the lines and say, okay, well, it applies to this project and or task, and it was this particular item. If it's an overhead charge, then again, you're skipping those two fields and putting in whatever the item is. But again, if I do want to link it up to the project that it would go to, you type in the project, code it to the task if needed. What's the item? Again, for charges like this, you might just go general. Otherwise, if it was an actual item that maybe you purchased, then you can go ahead and choose whatever that item is. I don't know what I'm going to choose from Costco, but let's just go with some random. So you would go through, fill out the detail. Item dictates the expense account, because we saw on the item list, it gave us the ability of linking up an expense account. So if we need to change it, you can, but it's defaulting from your actual item. Okay. Once you have those typical fields filled out, I checked on the box, so I get a couple of options in here. If I want to bring it into the system, I'm clicking on the process selected. If I want to just go ahead and say change the ones that I did, then you can do that. If you do not need to bring it into the system, because we had a couple of plaid outages, so maybe they brought in some duplicate lines. If you want to go ahead and say, okay, I already handled these ones, or maybe I entered them in manually because it was down and so I needed the charge in there out like really quickly, you can go ahead and mark them as cleared. It won't bring them into the system, but it will clear it from this list. Otherwise, you can also delete it, and that will just clear it, delete the whole thing as if it did not exist in here. But if you want to bring it into the system, you say process selected. Are you sure you want to do that? Yes. And then that would go ahead and actually hit that O3 project as a credit card charge. Okay. So the process is definitely different. And no, you do not have to manually add in the credit card charges like you saw me do before. That was if you're not doing plaid and if you're not importing. Some of our clients don't use their credit card a whole bunch. So for them, it's just easy and fine to just do the plus button to add in those charges. But for those that have a high volume or higher volume of credit card charges, the connector is definitely the best way to go. So whoever it would be, that would go in and kind of map those charges. You can give that access to multiple people if needed. Again, they have to be listed as a card user like we saw in the GL accounts. And then they would have access and go ahead and actually map their charges if needed. Okay. So that is credit cards. So in summary, your items is what I would go through first, right? So if you don't have those set up, you would go menu, admin, and system setup. We talk through adding in the items through purchasing. You have the expense report items and purchase items. Then also set up your approvers for purchase orders if you haven't done so already. You can adjust the list. So if I'm in menu, admin, and employees, whoops, I missed it. You can add in the order amount that they can approve up to if you needed to see that. So if I do PO limits on here, you can see who has those options or who does not have the order rights, right? So you can see I have one person that has $1 million. Actually, I have a couple. So this person has $1 million, 20,000. So this would give you a way to see who are my individuals that can go in and approve. You can click on that to kind of go tiered and show who has the highest limits. Mine's grouping by department, so it might look a little bit funky, but you can pull in order limit. Otherwise, if you click into their record, it's under the accounting tab, and that's where you're setting it. The last thing that I'll mention is expense reports. So we didn't really go over how to submit an expense report. You're going to do that through the plus button. Yeah, expense report's one of the first items, so you can do expense report. Once you add in the new line, then you get all of the fields. So when did I incur the expense? Does this hit a particular project? And if so, if not, then of course you're leaving this blank. Does it need to go down to the task level or not? This is where I would put details of what I would need to, what I incurred, right? Sorry, put details. Then you do have to choose the item. Again, this is not pulling off of the purchase items. This is only pulling off the expense report items. So we'll just go with public transportation. You can link it to an office if needed. You also have a comments field. It was one. It was going to be, I don't know, $17.80. Are we marking it up? If so, click on that. It's billable. And then also you can just indicate that you have a paper receipt. This is just a field to say, did you add that paper receipt in or not? And then to actually add in the receipt that you have, do attachment. It'll pull up your computer. You can find wherever that attachment is, click on it and hit open. And then that would actually attach it to that particular line. If you had multiple items, because maybe you drove somewhere or had someone drive you there, and then you also, purchased a meal for the client, then you can go in and indicate that with right. So you would typically not do 2 meals at, certain costs because they were probably all different costs. So then I might just say it was one, and the total for our bill was $68.40. Do we mark it up? Probably not. And again, you can do some with a paper receipt or some without, and that's how you can do your expense reports. There is an approval process, and that is also based off of individual person. So each person's approver might be a little bit different. I am my own approver, which 99% of the time you're not setting the person as their own approver for expense reports, but I'm listed as mine, so I can approve it. Otherwise, this would be a submit button, and it would go to whoever is listed as my expense report approver. All right, I'm going to go ahead and look at the other questions that we have. Okay, so we handled that one. Purchase from, is the drop-down listing available vendors to? Yes. So that's the one field where it's like a free type, and it will show vendors that we have in the system, but you actually don't have to choose it. So a lot of people say, well, do I have to have Starbucks listed as a vendor because they're not really, or maybe Target or whatever? No, you do not have to have them listed as a vendor, but it will bring up your vendor list. When building the budget, would you suggest adding the line item as a task in the schedule window in an expense section on that schedule? Building the budget, would you suggest adding the line item as a task? You can, but I don't really recommend doing that because your schedule should just be the workflow or the timeline of the project. So you can add in a line for expenses, but I don't really see the huge benefit for that. Then budget build occurs, hours allocated to schedule and task items and forecast expense items are entered. And then when the budget expense section in Workamajig is assessed, the expense is entered against that task. I mean, again, you can do that. I think I have 1 or 2 clients that do that, but it's showing up as a task in there, like an actual to do, whereas you're more using it as like a bucket for expenses. If you don't have to fill out tasks, then I don't really see the need for filling that out as a line item in your tasks. With the high volume of credit card charges, is it better to have an admin use the credit card connector rather than the team? I do have a lot that will not allow their team to add in credit card charges. But again, if you have a high volume, that might be all your accounting or your admin person is doing all day because it might take a while to map. So I mean, you can just have one person doing it. I do have several that do that, but I do have a lot that will go in and have their employees at least map the charges. And then those charges can go through an approval process. It's just in my, test site, I'm obviously set up as my own, but typically what would happen is once I fill out or create that that credit card charge, it would then send it through some sort of approval process. All right, so someone says, has anyone else using Plaid for American Express noticed dates being changed from Amex to Workamajig? It's an important note is that whatever Amex or Plaid sends us is all we're bringing in. So Workamajig itself is not changing it. So that might be a Plaid thing. If you're noticing that, you can always send that in. Screenshots are definitely helpful. If you can show us dates that you see in, like if you were to sign into your online banking, if you can show us, what's showing up in Amex and then what's different in Workamajig, we can always open a ticket with Plaid. Just know that Plaid's not as quick as maybe we are with our times. It takes usually days for them to even kind of acknowledge us. So you can always send that in if it's a big concern for you. Is there a template for CSV to upload credit card charges? Yes, that's a great question. So I'm going to go to the support guide because we have it set up. So if you go support.workamajig.com, that'll bring you to our help guide. And if you do import, actually, no, I don't know why I'm going here. It would be easiest if you go to menu, you have admin. This is where you would do all importing, and credit card charges would be no different. So menu, admin, import. You would type in credit card charges. And then you could do the export fields to CSV. It'll then show you every possible field and pull it into a CSV. You do not have to use every field, but here are your required fields. So at a minimum, here's what you need. Okay, so if you do the export, it's going to open up some sort of CSV file. I only have Office in here, so it always shows up like really weird, but I mean, it would kind of give you an idea. And then again, you can remove the fields that maybe you don't need in there. Oh, it's actually going to open. That's nice. So again, pulls in every single field that you can pull in. And then if you said, oh, we don't have GL companies, then you could just remove that field if you need to. But yes, this is kind of like a set way to do it. And again, you need a minimum of these particular fields. Okay. Someone else said, has anyone else using Plaid for American Express notice dates being different? Oh, sorry. I think I went over that one. Or maybe that was a duplicate question. Next one is, can there be a direct supervisor to approve and then also traffic our person to approve? There's only one approval for credit card charges, so there's not an option to set multiple approvers. It's just kind of like a all or really just one person. Oh, you're talking about expense reports. Yeah, same thing. There's only one approval for expense reports, but some clients convert their expense report to a vendor invoice, which could be a different person than who approved the expense report. So that might be an option there. Okay, so I think that's all of the questions, and we're about at time anyway, but again, the recording will be on your support.workamajig.com. If you go to the webinars and then past webinars, so we're in 2020, it'll show in here again in a couple of days, but you can see the ones that we've done previously. And then if you want to do a call with your account manager, you're more than welcome to email either support@workamajig.com, or you could do training@workamajig.com. Either one of those will work. Training obviously gets you to your scheduler or the scheduler, but if you do it to support, your account manager will forward it over. So either way, that'll get you to your person, and then you can chat more about it. Or of course, you can just email in any questions that you have as well, support@workamajig.com. Thank you guys so much, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.